I'll start off where I ended yesterday in my reading of the sixth chapter of Hart's The Concept of Law. Of these two ideas, supreme criterion and ultimate rule, the first is the easiest to define. We may say that a criterion of legal validity or source of law is supreme if rules identified by reference to it are still recognized as rules of the system, even if they conflict with rules identified by reference to the other criteria, whereas rules identified by reference to the latter are not so recognized if they conflict with the rules identified by reference to the supreme criterion. A similar explanation in comparative terms can be given of the notions of superior and subordinate criteria, which we have already used. It is plain that the notions of a superior and a supreme criterion merely refer to a relative place on a scale and do not import any notion of legally unlimited legislative power. Yet, supreme and unlimited are easy to confuse, at least in legal theory. One reason for this is that in the simpler forms of legal system, the ideas of ultimate rule of recognition, supreme criterion, and legally unlimited legislature seem to converge. For where there is a legislature subject to no constitutional limitations and competent by its enactment to deprive all other rules of law emanating from other sources of their status as law, it is part of the rule of recognition in such a system that enactment by the legislature is the supreme criterion of validity. This is, according to constitutional theory, the position in the United Kingdom. But even systems like that of the United States, in which there is no such legally unlimited legislature, may perfectly well contain an ultimate rule of recognition which provides a set of criteria of validity, one of which is supreme. Hmm. This will be so where the legislative competence of the ordinary legislature is limited by a constitution which contains no amending power or places some clauses outside the scope of that power. Here, there is no legally unlimited legislature, even in the widest interpretation of legislature, but the system, of course, contains an ultimate rule of recognition and, in the clauses of its constitution, a supreme criterion of validity. The sense in which the rule of recognition is the ultimate rule of a system is best understood if we pursue a very familiar chain of legal reasoning. If the question is raised whether some suggested rule is legally valid, we must, in order to answer the question, use a criterion of validity provided by some other rule. Is this purported bylaw of the Oxfordshire County Council valid? Yes, because it was made in exercise of the powers conferred and in accordance with the procedure specified by a statutory order made by the Minister of Health. At this first stage, the statutory order provides criteria in terms of which the validity of the bylaw is assessed. There may be no practical need to go further, but there is a standing possibility of doing so. We may query the validity of the statutory order and assess its validity in terms of the statute empowering the minister to make such orders. Finally, when the validity of the statute has been queried and assessed by reference to the rule that what the Queen in Parliament enacts is law, we are brought to a stop in inquiries concerning validity. For we have reached a rule which, like the intermediate statutory order and statute, provides criteria for the assessment of the validity of other rules. But it is also unlike them in that there is no rule providing criteria for the assessment of its own legal validity. There are indeed many questions which we can raise about this ultimate rule. We can ask whether it is the practice of courts, legislatures, officials, and private citizens in England to actually use this rule as an ultimate rule of recognition? Oh, this is key. Or has our process of legal reasoning been an idle game with the criteria of validity of a system now discarded? We can ask such a rule. We, we can ask whether it is a whether it's a satisfactory form of legal system. Wait. We can ask whether it is a satisfactory form of legal system which has such a rule at its root. Does it produce more good than evil? Are there prudential reasons for supporting it? Is there a moral obligation to do so? They are plainly very important questions. These are plainly very important questions. Particularly plainly, when we ask them about the rule of recognition, we are no longer attempting to answer the same kind of question about it as those we answered about other rules with its aid. Because it satisfies the rule that what the Queen in Parliament enacts is law, to saying that in England this last rule is used by courts, officials, and private persons as the ultimate rule of recognition, we have moved from an internal statement of law asserting the validity of a rule of that system to an external statement of fact which an observer of the system might make, even if he did not accept it. So too, when we move from the enactment, so too when we move from the statement that a particular enactment is valid to the statement that the rule of recognition of the system is an excellent one, and the system based on it is one worthy of support, we have moved from a statement of legal validity to a statement of value. Some writers who have emphasized the legal ultimacy of the rule of recognition have expressed this by saying that whereas the legal validity of other rules of the system can be demonstrated by reference to it, its own validity cannot be demonstrated, but is assumed or postulated, or is a hypothesis. This may, however, be seriously misleading. Statements of legal validity made about particular rules in the day-to-day life of a legal system, whether by judges, lawyers, or ordinary citizens, do indeed carry with them certain presuppositions. They are internal statements of law expressing the point of view of those who accept the rule of recognition of the system and, as such, leave unstated much that could be stated in external statements of fact about the system. What is thus left unstated forms the natural background or context of statements of legal validity and is thus said to be presupposed by them. But it is important to see precisely what the presupposed matters are, and not to obscure their character. They consist of two things. First, a person who seriously asserts the validity of some given rule of law, say a particular statute, himself makes use of a rule of recognition which he accepts as appropriate for identifying the law. Secondly, it is the case that this rule of recognition, in terms of which he assesses the validity of a particular statute, is not only accepted by him, but is the rule of recognition accepted and employed in the general operation of the system. Actually, if the truth of this presupposition were doubted, it could be established by reference to actual practice, to the way in which courts identify what is to count as law, and to the general acceptance of or acquiescence in these identifications. Neither of these two presuppositions are well described as assumptions of a validity which cannot be demonstrated. We only need the word validity and commonly only use it to answer questions which arise within a system of rules where the status of a rule as a member of the system depends on its satisfying certain criteria provided by the rule of recognition. No such question can arise as to the validity of the rule of recognition which provides the criteria. It can neither be valid nor invalid, but is simply accepted as appropriate for use in this way. To express the simple fact by saying darkly that its validity is assumed but cannot be demonstrated is like saying that we can assume but can never demonstrate that the standard meter bar in Paris which is the ultimate taste of the correctness of all measurement in meters, is itself correct. A more serious objection is that talk of the assumption that the ultimate rule of recognition is valid conceals the essentially factual character of the second presupposition which lies behind the lawyer's statements of validity. No doubt, the practice of judges, officials, and others, in which the actual existence of a rule of recognition consists, is a complex matter. As we shall see later, there are certainly situations in which questions as to the precise content and scope of this kind of rule, and even as to its existence, may not admit of a clear or determinate answer. Nonetheless, it is important to distinguish assuming the validity from presupposing the existence of such a rule. Assuming the validity from presupposing the existence. If only because failure to do this obscures what is meant by the assertion that such a rule exists. In the simple system of primary rules of obligation sketched in the last chapter, the assertion that a given rule existed could only be an external statement of fact, such as an observer who did not accept the rules might make and verify by ascertaining whether or not, as a matter of fact, a given mode of behavior was generally accepted as a standard and was accompanied by those features which, as we have seen, distinguish a social rule from mere convergent habits. It is in this way also we should now interpret and verify the assertion that in England a rule, though not a legal one, exists that we must bear the head on entering a church. If such rules as these are found to exist in the actual practice of a social group, there is no separate question of their validity to be discussed. Though of course, their value or desirability is often to question. Merci.